My children soon will be gods. この狩りの始まりだ。
Well, here we are. I mean, I don't know what to say about this except this is going to be a long one. And I'm saying this just letting you all know that the runtime of the video that I'm reacting to, which, by the way, it's just me, I'm not going to subject Nick to this because, number one, Nick is very sick. He actually... Originally, I thought it was food poisoning, but turns out, no, it was a literal stomach bug that I had, and now Nick's got it, and he's feeling the wrath of it, and he's doing his best, but he's still having a rough time. So, what I have here is The Adventures of Tintin and the Shadows of Giants. So, the truth is, over the last manner of weeks, a fan of the channel named Giotto Cook, who is also a Patreon supporter, which, if you want to support the channel, hint, hint, click, click. But yeah, Giotto Cook has taken it upon himself to send me clips, or send me donations, and said, hey, I want you to react to this over time on stream. So I was doing that, and we were about 2/3 of the way through it. Actually, I think about three-quarters of the way through. Yeah, we were about almost an hour in. And then, out of nowhere, another fan of the channel, another contributor, and another person who is very, very present on our streams, Mr. Anarchy17, came out of nowhere and just said, hey, I'm sick and tired of seeing this get reacted to in pieces. React to the whole thing. And he forked over a sizable donation for me to do that. And I'm a man of my word. So I'm going to react to this all 1 hour, 16 minutes, and 24 seconds. Give or take, with credits. But I'm going to react to all of this. And so you can thank Giotto Cook and Anarchy17. Collectively, I think overall this video has eaten up so much time on stream. I think it's eaten up, this and the Sinbad one ate up so much on stream, and I guess we're going to be watching it and we're going to be checking it out. The Adventures of Tintin, I used to watch the Tintin show on back when it was on HBO early in the Saturday mornings, I believe. Whenever I was staying at my grandma's actually had HBO as part of like her cable package, and yeah, it was a good show. I liked it. I watched it avidly, and I thought that it was very, very funny, very inventive, and had a lot of interesting stories to it. And to hear that RJ, it's strange that Belgium, or the Netherlands, Belgium, however you want to call it, but well, the whole deal with Belgium, the Netherlands, and that area is just, there's a lot of history. I was trying to get like in my head, which one was further north, and Netherlands is further north. Sorry, but that area is trenched in history. It has a lot of various things, and then of course, talk about Denmark. Denmark is one of the Viking countries. But okay, enough about me talking about that. I'll I'll get back to my original point. It's strange that Belgium, well, specifically Belgium, has produced several interesting animated shows that had a very impactful had a very impactful words. They fail me. I am so sorry. They had a very big impact on me whenever I was a kid, specifically by Hergé's The Adventures of Tintin, and then of course Pego with the Smurfs, which the Smurfs and Tintin, both Belgian. Unbelievable. Also, to complete my not my complete knowledge, but I know that Jean-Claude Van Damme is from Belgium, so he had quite an impact on me with action movies. And then of course Jacques Brel, who is a jazz pianist from Belgium. I've heard some of his work. Also, the movie In Bruges, which In Bruges, that's one of my favorite movies of the 2000s. Anyway, enough of me, just flapping my gums. We got to get to this video. This is The Adventures of Tintin and The Shadows of Giants by Breadsword. So, let's check it out. Here we go. Also, hold on. Okay. I'm just checking to make sure that the audio is not completely borked like it was last time. I'm so sorry, buddy. Hold on. There it is. Hello. Okay. Okay, we're good. We're good. Just wanted to make sure I didn't sound like a robot or sound like I was possessed.
Hey, this video is sponsored by NordVPN. If there's one thing that's especially indispensable in the age of information, it's the ability to protect it. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network, and what it does is keep your data safe behind
VPNs are the condoms of the internet.
And a wall of next-generation encryption so that third parties, including your own internet provider, can't spy on whatever you do. Whether you're scouring the internet for a copy of Pokemon Emerald that doesn't cost $1 trillion, or watching Samurai Champloo AMVs, NordVPN has got you covered. And being able to connect up to 6 devices to a single account lets me enter the serververse with a fresh suit of armor no matter where I go. Plus, if security isn't enough, having access to NordVPN servers across 59 countries means I can bypass region-specific limitations on the experiences I care about. Can't watch an anime opening because it's blocked in your country? No problem. Just a simple click, and as far as YouTube is concerned, I'm tapping in from the sandy shores of Japan. Live in a country where services like Discord are banned? Good news. You just moved from Dubai to New Brunswick, and you didn't even have to pack your things. And with a 30-day money-back guarantee, there's no downsides to giving it a spin around the old digital block. Right now, you can get a huge discount on a 2-year plan, plus 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/breadsword.
I could actually see Aisha using NordVPN.
Take control of your internet experience.
Although, Aisha, I can't recommend ExpressVPN enough.
Make sure your data stays cozy and safe. That's nordvpn.com.
Also, hold up. Let me fix Zach's tie here real quick. There we go. Or trying to fix his tie. There we go. Oh, man.
A long time ago, I wrote a video about how being a fan of something you're making a movie about can sometimes be kind of a bad thing. It's sort of a theory I had been developing, and the subject of it was Warcraft 2016. I love Warcraft. I've played all the RTSs, I own nearly every book, including the cookbook, the comics, the mangas, even the hard-to-get ones like Tides of Darkness, and I've played World of Warcraft since I was in 5th grade. Quite literally, I've been a fan of it for longer than I haven't been. And to put it plainly, the movie isn't very good. What's more, most of its shortcomings, to me at least, felt directly tied to its creator's unfaltering admiration for the source material. And that bothered me because I understood. I'd probably do the exact same thing. Its director, Duncan Jones, seemed like a lovely guy, someone I felt like I could probably get along with pretty well, and not just because we can both quote the NPCs from pretty much any city in the game.
Anubalore Delana. Keep your feet on the ground.
Time is money, friend! I could never really get it off the ground, though, and after a few months, I decided to shelve it. Besides, the film took enough of a beating without me joining the chorus. But it did leave me thinking, what would the opposite look like? An adaptation of a beloved series, something almost sacramental to its culture, created with an encyclopedic knowledge of its world and an intense love for everything in it, but with the necessary irreverence towards it to create something truly unique and fantastic and new from its fabric. I wonder what that would be like. Anyways, that's what I'm gonna spend the next however long I feel like talking cool about, so put in your thinking caps and strap in. I'm really smart, and this is The Adventures of Tintin in the Shadows of Giants.
Black strap, white handle, I got jungle fever. Black Benz, white truck, and 1-2-seater. I'm in the game getting changed like a parking meter.
I will say this, Breadsword is, like, his editing skills and his, like, the guy's talented. The guy's got a lot of talent, and I remember when I used to try and make videos like this, I kept trapping myself in the tedium, and I would often wind up spending too much time editing stuff that in the long run didn't matter, but in my mind I couldn't let it go. I mean, maybe I'd benefit from Adderall. I don't know. I mean, that's what Nick says. Nick says I should try and get some Adderall to see if it'll help. Because I want to do videos in this style, because I have a video that I want to talk about, like, I want to talk about concerning Princess Mononoke, which is my favorite Ghibli film, and it's not even close. Yeah, I know there's a lot of people out there who say that, you know, Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, Kiki's Delivery Service, yeah, everyone's got their favorite Ghibli film. Mine is Princess Mononoke, and it's a very deep and personal reason to me, and I wanted to make a video talking about it. But, sad to say, I don't think it's going to happen, because I think I've spent way too much time being a reaction channel, and if I started trying to make videos like that, everyone would just be like, stick to your lane.
And since takeover, it feels like the whole hood trying to get a Jenny Jones makeover. I got the hood on my shoulder, city on my back. They like, damn, I heard you charging 50 a track. I mean, you can at least give me a stack. You can't do all that hard work yourself and that give nothing back. You know how shit changed when your name get to buzzing. This year alone, I got 24 new cousins. Niggas popping out the woodworks, talking about you owe me. Mama, I'm famous, niggas hate me that don't know me. Yo. I know y'all surprised and shit when you see me on MTV, but keep your eyes glued to what, I don't know what channel that is out here, but Chicago, it's channel 7, ABC. You might fuck around, see me on Oprah Winfrey or something.
Alright, before we get to talk about The Adventures of Tintin, the movie, we gotta talk about The Adventures of Tintin, the Monolith. So, first and foremost, and for those not tapped in, what is Tintin? The Adventures of Tintin is a series of comics following a young reporter/adventurer named Tintin and his dog Snowy through a myriad of mysteries and quests they either embark on or accidentally fall into, often stealing them away to disparate mystical locations around the world, and featuring an ever-growing cast of eclectic supporting characters and recurring villains created by this guy, one of the most influential cartoonists in Europe's history and arguably the Walt Disney of their giant peninsula of smaller peninsulas. Anoj.
That's debatable. I think Peyo gives him a run for his money.
Its first pages appearing in the Belgian paper Le Petit Vingtième in January of 1929. Surviving through a subsequent world war, enemy occupation, famine, political and societal upheaval, and countless leaps forward in the worlds of art and technology, it retained its relevancy right up to the twilight of the 20th century, when in 1983, Hergé sadly passed away. And by my count, it is one of the longest running comic series helmed by a single creator ever. In America, never really got it. Since their release as collected books, what we now call graphic novels, beginning in the 1930s, about 200 million copies of Tintin have been sold around the world in more than 70 languages, including Welsh, Serbo-Croatian, Afrikaans, Arabic, and Esperanto. But the United States is only responsible for like 1% of that, which is why most of us in Flavortown, USA have a remarkably flimsy grasp of the truly gargantuan cultural impact that Tintin has. And among the many aspects of The Adventures of Tintin that make it so distinct, there are three that are especially important to understanding its success and the successful adaptation of it. The most immediately perceptible of these being style. The artistic philosophy of Linclair, the clear line, was born from Hergé's big brain and pioneered by his work, defined by the use of heavy, extremely clear lines to define its characters and featuring no hatching, fraying, or any indication of what he referred to as roughness whatsoever, cast against realistic backdrops with diminished contrast, very unlike his American counterparts. This style would go on to become the prevailing aesthetic of the Brussels school of Franco-Belgian cartoonists in the 30s through the 50s, most famously Edgar P. Jacobs, Bob Damore, Roger Leloup, and Jacques Martin.
Yeah.
Many of whom ended up working for Hergé. Second, the Saint Boniface Catholic Boy Scouts of Belgium. I promise this one makes sense. Hergé was a Boy Scout in his youth. In fact, a very accomplished one, rising to the rank of patrol leader and earning the name Curious Fox, in part due to the fact that he incessantly sketched everything he saw on their trips. Many panels throughout Tintin's adventures are pulled directly from his experiences as a young scout, and in a few instances, actual photographs of his own trips were used as one of the many visual references he was known to employ.
Also, fellow scout, I respect that. I was a member of the Boy Scouts of America, and I didn't get very far because when my parents got divorced, it basically just like destroyed my desire to advance as a member of the Boy Scouts, and I just lost all track of it. I miss it, and here's the thing: Nick was like this close to being an Eagle Scout. He was this close to getting his Eagle Scout merit badge. I think it was like he needed 2 or 3 more things for him to get his Eagle Scout badge. And that's pretty nuts, dude. That's pretty nuts that, Nick was that close and it was just like whisked away from him. Really wish that we could do something to give him his Eagle Scout badge.
As is the case with this panel from Tintin in Tibet in 1958, mirroring a picture of Hergé's troop taken 35 years prior, roped together on a climbing expedition through the Pyrenees. The importance of this is twofold. Not only was Hergé's first break as a cartoonist given to him by his scoutmaster René Weaverberg to provide illustrations for the Saint Boniface Scouts newsletter titled Jamais Essai, but Hergé's conception of Tintin was literally a Boy Scout. More specifically, what he imagined himself to be when he was one. He can never age, he can never have a love interest, he has no family, he has to be capable at anything he tries, ever curious, ever intrepid, and above all, he has to be kind and uphold the moral good wherever he goes, no matter the peril. And if that sounds familiar, it's because we got our own Boy Scout about a decade later, except ours has lasers and terrorizes British people.
Well, he terrorizes everybody who's not, okay, first off, I'll say this. Manchester Black deserved it. Manchester Black was an asshole in this film. By the way, this film is Superman versus the Elite, and yeah, Manchester Black, the leader of the Elite, was a right jerk.
Holy.
Where did he go? Where did he freaking go?
Orbit. He went into orbit at Mach 7.
If you listen.
I think we'd better get back to Marlinspike, Captain.
Anyways, he can't make eye contact with women and knows how to fire a gun, but instead of becoming the Joker, he blossoms into young Indiana Jones with a dog who can talk to himself and an alcoholic best friend with a cool mansion. It's like if Case Closed was written by George Lucas, which can... Conveniently enough, brings me to the third main ingredient in this Professor Utonium potion of a perfect series, the composition of the panels themselves. Hergé often said of the adventures of Tintin that he wasn't drawing cartoons, he was filming movies on paper. And this is, I think, the least commonly praised, but most important quality of the three. Take this page from Tintin and the Prisoners of the Sun, for instance. The clarity in the lines and the framing of each shot illustrates such a clear sense of direction and scale. There's never a moment where we're left unsure how perilous or harsh or fast or gentle or slow anything in this world is, because it is a world in motion that Hergé is simply capturing the pictures of. The momentum and the intentionality that he's capable of rendering in each panel transcends the language within it, and this is largely influenced by his love of silent films, specifically those by Charlie Chaplin, Harry Langdon, and Buster Keaton. In fact,
the whole deal with Buster Keaton is a lot of people's inspiration. I mean, Jackie Chan says that Buster Keaton is his go-to in terms of filmmaking and understanding, building tension and actually showing the true scale of stunts and how dangerous they can be.
In fact, your boy was such a maniac for the movies that 2 of the most iconic characters in The Adventures of Tintin, the incompetent detectives Thompson and Thompson, are basically just Charlie Chaplin if he duplicated himself through mitosis. He also helped pioneer the use of speech blurbs in the comic industry of Europe to do away with the innate breaks in immersion and sightlines that came with the old way of captioning cartoons at the top and bottom of panels. In his earliest days as an illustrator, Hergé used to introduce his works with United Rovers Presents a Great Comic Film, followed by the single credit, Hergé, director. So it's no small wonder that the true dream was to bring Tintin to the masses through the silver screen. But there was just one problem. Hergé didn't trust anybody to do it. And the only person he had reached out to, Walt Disney, was forced to decline due to production backlogs. Before Hergé passed away, 5 different films had been adapted from the world of Tintin, and every single one of them was a spectacular failure in their own way. The first one, The Crab with the Golden Claws, was a stop-motion puppet production. The second and third are live-action, starring flesh-and-blood actors, but both of their original stories feel like weird imitations of the real ones, and although I'm sure they tried their best, the cast simply couldn't sell it. And what's especially sad about these 2 is Hergé himself knew this would happen. Once responding to a young reader's letter...
Sad to say, there's a lot you can get away with in live-action, but animation is much... And once again... You know, Hergé, I guarantee you, had like all the aspirations in the world for his works to be portrayed properly as as films. I mean, that's what he wanted. I mean, he basically drew out storyboards, and sadly, he never got to see a true accomplished version of it.
What if the living Tintin, the Tintin in the film, didn't come close to resembling the Tintin in the books? If you and all the spectators refuse to recognize your Tintin and the actor portraying him, I am sure that after calling him out on it, you'll chase him off as an imposter. And finally, after the 2 animated films which would follow failed to capture the essence of Tintin as well, Hergé resolved that Tintin would simply never grace a projector reel again. And he didn't. For 40 years. On the other side of the planet at the same time, a young Steven Spielberg was gearing up to reshape the film industry forever, with his debut 1-2 punch of the Sugarland Express starring Goldie Hawn and the first summer blockbuster of all time, Jaws.
You know, why don't they talk about Duel? Literally, that was one of Steven Spielberg's first films. I know that, you know, everyone talks about Jaws. Everyone talks about... Dude, you want to talk about someone who's really... Like, early Spielberg was really good at building tension. And Duel is one of my favorite examples of just like... I know some people consider the film boring, but the tension building, you cannot get around it. Oh my god.
Beginning a hot streak of back-to-back bangers that would continue pretty much until present day. After Jaws' release in 1975, boom, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. 1979, how about 1941? And when the 80s hit, our boy Stevie went what I think is medically referred to as sicko mode, dropping what is still the most played film I've ever owned next to a goofy movie, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Oh, it's so fucking good. This guy was on a run like mixtape-era Lil Wayne, and after foreign critics began comparing him and Big George's archaeology adventure Palooza to a more popular protagonist from across the pond, S. Breezy discovered the world of Tintin, and not long after, fell completely under its spell. Within a year of The Lost Ark taking theaters by storm, Hergé received the news. A hot boy director from the States wanted to bring Tintin to the motion pictures, and this one meant it. Despite his reservations, Hergé considered Spielberg to be a genius, and to everyone's surprise, said yes. Forevermore, the only person allowed to option a script from him or the estate after he had passed was the gamer himself. And his faith in Spielberg alone can't be understated. The first round of negotiations actually fell through because Hergé noticed a clause in the contracts stating that a different director could helm the project if Spielberg for whatever reason couldn't. To quote Michael Farr, resident Tintin historian, Hergé thought Spielberg was the only person who could ever do Tintin justice. If Stevie wanted it, he had to commit. And the influence of this cycle of negotiations and development is immediately apparent in the Indiana Jones which followed. Temple of Doom is heavily inspired by Cigars of the Pharaoh, The Blue Lotus, Prisoners of the Sun, and the Red Sea Sharks. And Spielberg wasn't shy about this. Gangsters in Shanghai, The Ritual Sacrifices, The Volcanic Lair, and A Priceless Treasure from an Ancient Ruler all came straight from the pages of Hergé's Boy Scout and Blue. I mean, Short Round is literally Chow, a friend of Tintin's from China. Sadly, Hergé passed away during the film's production, the same week Spielberg had planned to meet him in London to discuss Tintin. And his passing, along with what he and his widow had left in Spielberg's hands, were taken anything but lightly. Over the next 30 years, Spielberg would continuously pay Hergé's estate to renew his option on a script. the only person allowed to option a script, constantly rewriting, retooling, and reconceptualizing how to best honor Hergé's wishes and finally give the Adventures of Tintin a film it deserves. Different formats, different comics, different crews, different scripts, and eventually different mediums entirely. By the 2000s, Spielberg no longer had two choices, live action or traditional animation, but three, with computer animation's rapid ascent in both prominence and quality. And it just so happened a certain oomphy by the name of Peter Jackson not only had just come off the back of The Lord of the Rings and King Kong, films which utilized at that point the most impressive motion cap animation in history, but he was also a die-hard Tintin fan. And so he suggested to Spielberg what Spielberg seemed to already know, that there was only one possible way for them to bring Tintin to life. And they would soon prove themselves right. Cue opening. Okay, so the film opens on an extremely long credits roll over these shadowbox animations recounting various scenes and events from the original comics. And although I'm usually more of a credits at the end kind of a guy on account of my attention span being completely shot, this one is honestly pretty fair, because when the Big Berg finally committed to the Adventures of Tintin, he might as well have assembled the goddamn Avengers. This movie's cast and crew read like the filmmaking equivalent of a fantasy football team. Calling it stacked feels like an understatement. First of all, co-produced by the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, Steven Spielberg, Peter Jackson, and Kathleen Kennedy. Screenplay by, I don't know, how about Edgar Wright? I mean, if John Williams could have somehow composed the score for this, I think it could have been one of the greatest adventure films of all time.
And
just fucking kidding. Of course Spielberg got John Williams to compose the score.
Of course. I mean, you got George Lucas and Steven Spielberg working on it. Also, you can't throw out Stephen Moffat, Edgar Wright. You can't throw out. I know Edgar Wright. He talked about Edgar Wright. Stephen Moffat, love his work for Sherlock and also for Doctor Who, and then Joe Cornish, who is a very close co-writer with Edgar Wright, and I love it.
How about Edgar Wright? I mean, if John Williams could have somehow composed the score for this, I think it could have been one of the score. What do you think this is? Amateur hour? What's your problem? Stop. You're making a scene. Stop. Ow! DP, we're talking the Polish premier himself, Janusz Kaminski. Editor, the Louis Vuitton Don Michael Kahn. Casting directors from both The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, aka the best one. And the cast itself is bellissimo. As if God herself blessed the casting sheets to please me specifically. Jamie Bell as Tintin, Andy Serkis as Captain Haddock, Daniel Craig as Mr. Ivanovich Sakharin, and what I'm absolutely convinced is the single greatest casting choice of all time, Nick Frost and Simon Pegg as Thompson and Thompson.
Yes. You could not have picked two better dudes to be Thompson and Thompson.
The only way they can make this film any better is if its only consistent side character was voiced by Dobby or something. You idiot! I fooled you again! You should know better! No, but seriously, you're really getting on my nerves. Anyways, after the obscenely long credits come to an end, we finally get to catch our very first glimpse of the world of Tintin, the way Hergé entrusted Spielberg to bring it to life. And it is genuinely insane. Whenever I show this movie to friends, there are always two things I hear during this first scene. One, I can't believe how good it looks, and two, I can't believe that it's not weird. This is because every feature-length mocap film made before this falls in what I call the funny zone, on account of the fact that they all
the
look
Uncanny
like
Valley,
garbage.
dude.
Monster House, The Polar Express, Beowulf, A Christmas...
Okay, Monster House doesn't... Okay. For the most part, doesn't look like garbage. The whole deal with the motion capture films at this time is the Uncanny Valley of the face animations, and I really want them to do a remake of Polar Express. Do a remake of Polar Express with the modern technology and get a good cast. And not only that, but you could have Tom Hanks come back as a conductor. That'd be cool. But dude, there are so many people that you could get to be in the... And also, give the kids names. Let us relate with the kids. Sheesh.
Christmas Carol, Mars Needs Moms, Final Fantasy, The Spirit Within. This shit is clown world, bad stuff with a capital B, and it forever tarnished the reputation of and the hope for creating animated motion capture films. So seeing one that is actually executed incredibly well is really pretty jarring to people. I mean, there's 8 of these things in existence. They're like Sinistar cabinets, and the only other solid looking one is Avatar, which utilized the technology in the exact opposite direction, entirely avoiding the aesthetics of animation in the first place. And funnily enough, Avatar was shot on the same soundstage as The Adventures of Tintin.
Yeah, Weta Workshop. I mean, dude, you cannot get around Weta Workshop and the amazing people who work for them.
Shoutouts to James Cameron. Come out to the Valley sometime, I'll get you a boba. It's on me. Patreon.com/breadsword. I have an addiction. The frantic, playful theme which carried us through the credits fades beneath the ambience of a quietly bustling street in a market in Belgium as we open on a palette of oil paints shimmering in the morning sun. Tintin, out of frame, conversing with its owner as he captures his portrait, remarking that he's seen him before in the papers because he's a reporter. Tintin gently corrects him that he's a journalist, as Snowy is introduced by his side and then quickly pulled out of focus as a pair of shoes step into the foreground. The camera and Snowy both leaving the painter's booth to follow our new faceless friend through the quaint European street as he robs its denizens blind. The music of the market now rising above its chatter as if to imply that what he's performing is more ritual dance than it is theft. Employing the same delayed introduction of its protagonist as Spielberg used in Raiders of the Lost Ark, we cut back to the painter and Tintin about a minute later as he hands him his caricature, finally revealing his face as he's cast cleverly against Erge's design of him. I really love this film's opening few minutes because it's illustrative of the delicate balance Spielberg and company managed to strike in the adaptation of this world. References to the comics and Easter eggs are still existent, of course, but they're presented wordlessly and without emphasis, unless it's relevant to the development of the plot or its world or its characters. Many of the potential pitfalls of a self-effacing adaptation are still present, but they're all disarmed or subverted. Okay, I can't take it. I have to talk about it. Warcraft 2016 is set around the time of the first RTS game, Warcraft Orcs and Humans, and it is a movie that is about orcs and humans. First off, and sorry in advance, Duncan, you could not pick a worse foundation for a first movie in the Warcraft universe if you tried. Even amongst fans of the games when this was announced, there were already worried conversations about how ill-advised of a choice this was, and for a very simple reason. It is way, way too much.
It's too broad. It's way too broad of a subject. Like, look, you need to have focus. You need to have focus in order to, like, build a foundation, and then you can do the big grandiose things. And because when you establish all these characters with all the previous films, you don't need to do... It's just like what Avengers pulled off. I don't think it can be stated enough what Avengers Endgame pulled off is just... so good.
Warcraft as a narrative vessel is very much a shell, within which countless micro and macro narratives take place over eons of in-universe time, typically denoted by great wars or eras a la Middle-earth. And what allows this to be digestible to a player is that they are fed to them singularly with a single character or small group for the player to identify with for any given questline or campaign. And this has one fatal flaw when transposed to film. A huge amount of the storytelling in Warcraft is dependent on the player's mutual empathy for both sides of its central, never-ending conflict, orcs and humans, horde and alliance, whatever, which it develops over weeks, months, years of sitting inside a gamer's gooey, gloppy brain. Duncan Jones, because he's a fan of Warcraft, didn't want to compromise on this fundamental disconnect between the structure of an entire game and the construction of a good film. So he decides to follow both sides of the conflict at once, changing every 15 minutes for like 2 hours. And this is a choice that a fan would make that makes the end result feel almost impenetrable to anyone who isn't already a fan of the universe. What's so uniquely depressing about this is that there are some excellent examples of stories he could have adapted, I could have adapted, with the resources allotted to him that could have worked brilliantly as films, the most obvious of which being the story of Arthas Menethil and the Lich King. It was made clear that the Warcraft movie was initially intended to set the foundations for a cinematic universe before it got wombo comboed off the face of the earth by every critic.
Wombo combo? Ow, ow, ow! That ain't Falco.
They're lived. So you could have easily taken the events of Warcraft 3 and its expansion, The Frozen Throne, and divided them across 3 films, with a consistent protagonist to carry the viewer through them.
Yeah, the Lich King would... dude, I would love to have seen the Lich King on film. The Lich King, dude, if they'd have done that right... Oh, man.
Part 1 ends with a calling of Stratholme.
I'm sorry, Arthas. I can't watch you do this.
Poor Jaina.
What you doing with that? Wait a buck.
Part 2, he's stabbing his dad like it's Power Sword Sunday, and Part 3 ends with him sitting on the throne and becoming the ice sculpture from Groundhog's Day. Sweet, sexy, and to the point, but most importantly, for God's sakes, simple. Anybody can follow a main character in a small supporting cast, but when you put 15 in front of them and they all fundamentally disagree on who deserves the right to live, but they're all right and they're all wrong, and also fell magic exists, and here's Moros, because the fans who played in 2007 will remember Moros from Karazhan because he dropped a belt that was decent for warlocks, and you couldn't have just introduced Medivh by himself because the fans will recognize Moros, maybe, and now the film is longer, and the viewer has been introduced to another nothing character and has spent less time with the central figure of this story that you're trying to introduce in this scene. It becomes a little frustrating. Jones, in the first handful of minutes of the film, introduces the viewer to Stormwind, one of the human capitals, then introduces a mage from Dalaran, another human capital, but he makes it a point to say he's part of the Kirintor, the order who rule Dalaran, which you wouldn't know if you didn't already know that, because God forbid he just says where the guy is from. And then he sends him and the guy who found him through Elwyn Forest to Goldshire, to the Lion's Pride Inn, to have a conversation they could have had in the first location, which contextually doesn't even make sense to have here. Because
oh god. In more capable hands, I think that the World of Warcraft franchise in film could be on its third movie by now, maybe fourth, but nope. Instead, we're just stuck. We're stuck here, and it's just like World of Warcraft is slowly dying.
Because it's a war council with the king of Stormwind, in which he has a keep that they were just inside of. But the players would be excited to see this because it's Lion's Pride Inn, which has zero narrative significance to anything, but the players will get it because it's the place that they know, and that's it. Like, they have this travel montage from Stormwind to there, and it's only like a handful of seconds long because the physical location is right down the road from Stormwind. But Duncan wants an excuse to show a Murloc so that he can make it do the Murloc sound. Because the fans will like the Murloc sound, and it's like, shut the fuck up. God, dude, like, and the ending! I mean, sorry, over it. I'm over it. Jones never gave his Warcraft adaptation a chance to shine because he was too busy standing under its shadow. Compare this to Steven Spielberg's The Adventures of Tintin, which by my count has a zillion more references to its past adventures and beloved characters than Warcraft, but not once interrupts or extends a conversation, shot, or story beat to include them. The board of portraits behind the painter's booth in these two shots isn't just a portfolio, it's a collection of the many different characters Tintin has encountered throughout the comics, and I didn't pay any attention to it the first few times I saw it because it's out of focus and in the background. But now that I am thoroughly Tintin-pilled because I spent the last 2 months
well, what are those red pill and blue pill
focus and in the background. But now that
the Disney movie Have Free Time, Enjoy Life, hour-long video about a Belgian cartoon, nothing but pain, never smile again.
I'm thoroughly Tintin-pilled because I spent the last 2 months doing nothing but absorbing everything I could about the Adventures of Tintin. I can recognize everyone here by 1/8 of their head being visible. Al Capone, Alfred and Hector Allenbeck, Alonzo Perez, Bill the Cook, the Bird Brothers Max and Gustav, Colonel Fouad, Colonel Spawns, Corporal Diaz, Didi Chen Yi, Dr. Ridgewell, Fakir Ramacharma, Fred the Janitor, Jolyon Wag, Kavyarovich, McGregor, Mike McAdam the Hotel Detective, Oliveira de Figuera, Professor Decimus Fossley, R.W. Trickler, and Sophocles Sarcophagus from the Cigars of the Pharaoh. They're in the background of a couple shots for collectively about 8 seconds. No mention given, no focus pulled. After our introductory spiel, Tintin finds Snowy across the market, and as he pets him, a model ship comes into view in the reflection of a mirror. The music of the market promptly hushed by a solitary piano key. John Williams' The Secret of the Scrolls, setting the stage for the inceptive object of the adventure we're about to be taken on.
A unicorn. Unicorn. Man-o'-war sailing ship. It's very old, that is. 16th century.
17th, I would think.
Reign of Charles I.
Charles II.
That's what I said, Charles II. As fine a ship as ever sailed the 7 seas. You won't find another one of these, mate.
Something I especially appreciate about the way Wright reintroduces Tintin in this film is that he kind of speedruns the Boy Scout bullet points Hergé had laid out, but in a much more natural-feeling way. Hergé didn't exactly have the luxury of nuance in the initial few comics which Tintin are introduced in, and because of that, Tintin's never really had the chance to introduce himself until now. Young, determined, knowledgeable, but polite, and with an incredible zeal for anything which piques his interest or speaks to his adventurous nature, all demonstrated by himself in his first 2 interactions in the film. After paying the merchant, the music immediately darkens, becoming more rushed as a bass and some cellos emerge into the picture, an aural reflection of what the ship entering his hands represents. His interests, characterized by the piano notes, has pulled him into something much more perilous than he could possibly be aware, but it's too late to turn back now. Speaking of turning around, here comes the plot right now.
Hey, bud, how much for the boat?
I'm sorry, I just sold it to this young gent.
Oh, yeah? Tell me what you paid, and I'll give you double.
Double?
Thanks. But it's not for sale.
Look, kid, I'm trying to help you out. I don't think you realize this, but you're about to walk into a whole mess of danger.
What kind of danger?
I'm warning you. Get rid of the boat and get out while you still can. These people do not play nice.
What people?
God, I love this setup. Tintin comics always reside within one of two basic categories, adventures or mystery.
God.
And although both of these storytelling styles are present throughout the series,
I also they play the pronoun game. It's like them, they. It's like these people don't play by. It's like who? Come on, man.
typically one always dominates each book, but Wright strikes off with an immediate tone setter straight down the middle. This film is going to be both of them all the way, the entire time. I mentioned earlier that some of the previous adaptations of Tintin were original stories that felt like cheap imitations of the real ones, and others were one-to-one copies of a specific comic. And this is the same issue Duncan Jones faced with Warcraft 2016. When you respect the material you're adapting from too much to change it without your hand being forced, you are doomed to either poorly emulating it or copying it beat for beat. And both of these paths make for flat, unexciting filmmaking. The trick is taking everything that works and casting everything that doesn't deep, deep down into the abyss. Spielberg's The Adventures of Tintin is loosely based around two comics, The Secret of the Unicorn and Red Rackham's Treasure.
Wait.
Spielberg's The Adventures of
Did he
Tintin
just
is
use
loosely based around two comics.
Excel Saga. Hail Lord Il Palazzo.
It's The Secret of the Unicorn and Red Rackham's Treasure, but it takes precious little from them, although the names may be deceiving. The slow burn mystery of The Secret of the Unicorn and the globe-trotting adventure across the high seas of Red Rackham's Treasure, along with a few characters and vehicles from other comics, are the only things that make the cut. In the same way that it is both an adventure and a mystery, it is also both an adaptation and an original story, and that's precisely why it slaps. Mr. Sakharine in the comic The Secret of the Unicorn is just a harmless ship collector, caught in the crossfire of a dramatic ordeal, not unlike Tintin here, where the Bird brothers function as the main antagonists, but smartly realizing that for the film to cover as much ground as it does, it can only have like 5 real characters. Wright acts as its original villains and reimagines Sakharine as the main antagonist of the film, elevating him from kind of goofy side character to the best villain in Tintin's entire canon. Anyways, after Tintin is warned by the nice man, Daniel Craig propositions him to give up the boat for a blank check. Tintin says no, hearth back home, and Sakharine menacingly asks the shopkeep who he was, to which he responds,
"Everybody knows him. That's Tintin."
Cutting back to Tintin's apartment, Tintin quickly places the unicorn on a dresser and searches for a magnifying glass to get a closer look. This is the only time where references to the existence of the comics are given any sort of prominence in the film, but this is because they're used as supplementation for exposition in the text as to who Tintin is, an expository trope often used in noir films from the 30s through the 50s, which is what Spielberg is largely drawing upon from our maritime mystery to be. Think Fritz Lang's While the City Sleeps, or for a more contemporary example, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. We've had two people speak of him matter-of-factly being a face that the public knows, but now we get to know why that is. Again, consideration for an audience who has no conception of Tintin as a monolith. To a first-time viewer, this is just efficient exposition as he searches his desk, but to fans, these are nods to the most iconic tales in the adventures of Tintin, presented in the same styling as the newspaper clippings Hergé himself would often employ for the same purpose. The more high-flying a story is, the less clearance it has for takeoff. So as the adventures became more exciting and complex, Hergé needed a way to skip through all the boring parts, like searching for a magnifying glass. Directing films on paper. Snowy finally finds the magnifying glass and then instantly undoes this kindness by knocking the model of the unicorn off of the dresser while chasing a cat around the apartment a la Tom and Jerry. Bit of a fun fact, this cat is in the comics as well and is believed to be based on Hergé's own Siamese cat, Taiki. I have learned too much about Tintin. My brain has begun to physically reject new information. A silver cylinder falls out of the ship's broken main and is then kicked under the dresser before Tintin notices it. We'll come back to this, it's important. Tintin then resolves that something must have happened on the ship that it's a model of and then heads off to the library in a huff. Another iconic noir trope, which I love. Every good mystery needs a library.
Oh yeah.
Tintin discovers that
Thank you for the John Wick clip.
the original unicorn was an ill-fated voyage under one Captain Sir Francis Haddock, former owner of Marlinspike Hall, which Mr. Sakharine had mentioned earlier as the estate he had just bought, to which the model ship he tried to get from Tintin used to belong. The ship was said to have been attacked by pirates and all hands were lost except for Haddock himself, who was rescued and returned home, but he was convinced that his family name had been cursed henceforth. Long believed to have been carrying a secret, valuable cargo, historians could never locate its wreck, and Sir Francis's ominous last words were, "Only a true Haddock will discover the secret, the unicorn." I realize I'm spending a lot of time on this movie's setup, but it's because it sets it up so well. Just as the music began to rise in intensity after Tintin bought the ship, so too does the plot itself. And as luck would have it, we're about to shift up a gear. Tintin goes back to his apartment, realizes he got caught lacking, and immediately heads to Marlinspike Hall because obviously the just barely hiding it villain he met earlier that day must have taken it. But to his and our surprise, the unicorn he finds in Sakharine's possession isn't his, because it's not broken. But then why are there two of them, and what's the importance behind them? Tintin poses the same questions as we do, and Sack's fifth over here doesn't particularly care for it. On his way out, Nestor, the butler who had cold-cocked him for breaking and entering just moments ago, tells Tintin that it's a shame that the mast on his ship broke, and that he hopes he found all the pieces, and that some things are so easily lost. Of course Sakharine stole it, but he's hiding why. Cut back to the apartment again, and this time it's been completely ransacked, but luckily the thieves didn't find what they came for because, remember, the cylinder from the mast had been kicked under the dresser, along with the scroll kept hidden inside of it.
Just like that, we're off on a mystery.
3 brothers joined, 3 unicorns in company. Sailing in the noonday sun will speak. For 'tis from the light that light will dawn, and then shines forth the eagle's cross.
Something I really appreciate about this film, just generally speaking, but that I think this moment highlights particularly well, is how much of a 4,000 IQ composer John Williams is.
Yeah.
The guy's become so good at composing for adventures specifically that he's developed his own musical shorthand for them, and for some reason I never really noticed it until now. Every time he introduces the hero of a tale, or the object which represents the journey the hero is about to embark on, he uses the same instrument. Here, watch it again.
Tubular bells. The tubular bells, man.
What's this?
Did you catch
Iconic.
it? Good. Now check this out.
Yep. The tubular bells just go so hard, man. Oh, the whimsy.
The solo celesta, which is the light almost
Solo celesta? I thought it was tubular bells.
An instrument you're hearing there is John Williams' secret key to the imaginations of children and gamers alike all around the world. And you best believe when you hear it, we're ramping up for a ding-dang fun time. I've taken a calling this getting headwigged. Trapped alone under a staircase, headwigged. Trapped alone on a desert planet, headwigged. Trapped alone on a regular planet, headwigged. Trapped alone in Chicago, you know you're getting that capital H, brother. Also, I love when, along with the changes in music, the sound design of the location an object represents often replaces the sound design of the environment it exists within.
I feel like an idiot now that I didn't realize it was like a solo chest. I thought it was. I swear to God, I thought it was tubular bells. But oh well.
Like when the sound of the street market is replaced by the sound of the ocean as Tintin looks at the unicorn. Really cool, great job, big thumbs up. Anyways, a buzzer interrupts Tintin's reading, and who else do we find at the door but the FedEx guy from earlier, here to deliver us our next major beat in the plot. Except, whoopsie, this time he gets shot 30 times in the back for it. Spielberg is definitely hitting Disney musical pace in terms of how quickly he introduces and then solidifies his really obvious antagonist as being evil, but instead of having him sing Poor Unfortunate Souls, and in the interest of keeping with the noir aesthetic he's evoked, it's just a scared man sputtering a warning to the protagonist through sheer terror before being murdered in a drive-by in front of him. But before our Burger King crowned comrade logs out for the big AFK, he dutifully spells out a message to Tintin on the newspaper he'd been carrying with him.
Caribou Jean.
Caribou Jean!
Does that mean anything to you?
Great Scotland Yard! That's extraordinary!
What is?
Worthington's having a half-price sale on bowler hats. Really, Thompson?
The Thompsons are finally here. Nick Frost and Simon Pegg's chemistry as these two is crazy. I talked a bit about the failures of the live-action Tintins, and one of the most prominent L's between them is how noticeably different Thompson and Thompson are from each other, betraying the entire point of their characters and the comedy derived from them. Being that is the case, I genuinely can't think of any better casting choice for these two. And apparently neither could Spielberg, because he invited them to the set out of necessity, as the Thompsons can only truly be played by a comedic duo who can act identically, and they play them to a T. The two explain that the man who was killed was actually an Interpol agent, but no one knows what he was on to. Promptly initiating the B-plot to the movie, the Thompsons stumbling through a case to track down the pickpocket that the film opened up with, just as the A-plot, Tintin being knocked unconscious and taken captive by Sakharine, is clear for takeoff.
Mr. Tin.
Yes?
Delivery for you.
But I didn't order anything.
Well, that's because it's you. It's getting delivered.
Aside from Spielberg biting off Madagascar 2, this sequence is great. Snowy gets this excellent chase scene through Brussels trying to catch up to the henchman who took Tintin. The music underscoring it is fantastic. I love Williams' musical conception of the various characters' identities, and the maneuvering of the camera throughout it is nuts. If there's one thing this movie indisputably nails, it is definitely the chase scenes. After the chase concludes though, Tintin wakes up in a cell like an Oblivion character, and Sakharine finally gets to go mask off, allowing Daniel Craig to once again prove that he can sell the absolute piss out of some quiet menace. Following this tense interaction with Sakharine,
Yeah, he's a great actor. Like, everyone knows him as Bond, but and now because of the Knives Out movie, or because of like Knives Out and The Glass Onion, a lot of people now know him as Benoit Blanc, which, you know, he's awesome as Benoit Blanc. But Daniel Craig is just such a versatile actor, and for him to be menacing here is such... it shows his... it shows his depth as an actor.
Over the scrolls from the unicorn, wherein Tintin reveals that he no longer has his because the pickpocket from earlier lifted his wallet just after meeting the Thompsons. Snowy arrives and springs him from his bonds. Snowy's characterization in this film is excellent, by the way. In the comics, Snowy serves as both the audience stand-in and the cheerleader for the team, reacting to situations on our behalf, knowing none of the other characters can understand him, often even breaking the fourth wall to hype Tintin up after he has a good idea, or quip to us about how stupid he can be. This would obviously translate terribly to film. Spielberg could never compete with Scooby-Doo 2002, so Tintin is given this role instead, and uses Snowy to kind of bounce off of. This, along with Snowy's literal constant movement in the shots where Tintin is still, offer a lot more fluidity and perceived momentum to the slower moments in the film. There's never any slack, no matter what.
What was the ship carrying, Snowy?
This next scene, from being freed by Snowy to escaping the brig with an improvised grappling hook, along with the ship and its crew, are actually lifted from another Tintin comic, The Crabs with the Golden Claws, a mystery about smuggling opium where the mutinous crew of the
Also, Caribou John. There you go.
Another Tintin comic, The Crabs with the Golden Claws, a mystery about smuggling opium where the mutinous crew of the Caribou John, that's the name of the ship, keep their alcoholic captain sedated with whiskey so that he can't take it back. Wright takes this narrative device and then superimposes it over the loose ideas he had kept from The Secret of the Unicorn and Red Rackham's Treasure, placing Sakharine as the mastermind of the Caribou John's mutiny instead of its first mate Alan, and their intentions at this point being altogether unclear. But we do have a clue.
Tintin, by the way.
Haddock. Archibald Haddock.
There's a longboat up on deck. Follow me. Hang on a second. Did you say haddock?
Also, huge points for the Sword Cane. You are not slick, Steven Spielberg. This is Scrooge McDuck in an archive Gucci suit. Captain Haddock is one of the most important characters in the adventures of Tintin, and my personal favorite, having become a fixture of the series as its deuteragonist immediately after being introduced in The Crabs of the Golden Claws, where he first appears being struck in the back of the head by Tintin, just like this. Andy Serkis absolutely kills it as Haddock. He is undoubtedly the standout performance of the film, and a significant reason as to why that is that he manages to capture the most vocally expressive character in the canon in spite of the fact that his voice has never been heard. I don't mean literally never heard. He's in every previous movie as well as the animated series, but he's never felt like him in them. Edinger once writing after his disappointment with the adaptation of Temple of the Sun that he didn't like Captain Haddock in it because he doesn't have the same voice as the books. This is an almost frustratingly vague criticism to make on the surface, but when you've spent a lot of time with the world and its characters...
I was gonna say, when you read through in different accents, you know, at Haddock, it's like, well, that's where we're going. We've been invited to the Congress. Guests of honor, you know, the first men on the moon. No, by thunder, adventures are out, right now, right out, for good. This is a pleasure trip, an ordinary flight. No fuss, no upsets, no commotion.
It begins to make a lot more sense.
Whereas if you read it through in like a British accent,
when you've spent a lot of time...
it's like, well, that's where we're going. We've been invited to the Congress. Guests of honor. You know, the first men on the moon. No, by thunder. Adventures are out. Right out. For good. This is a pleasure trip. An ordinary flight. No fuss, no upsets, no commotion. It doesn't work as much, and it doesn't characterize Haddock as good.
Time with the world and its characters, it begins to make a lot more sense. Haddock is known for a few basic qualities besides drinking, not the least of which being his ferocity and his vitality. Constantly the first man to pick a fight or charge into one, and always the first to follow Tintin and Snowy into danger, even after protesting that he doesn't want to. He's equal parts outrageous and gentle, prone to self-pity while at the same time fiercely defensive of his pride. And the difficulty in playing him is not just having the range to perform both, but the ability to perform both naturally simultaneously. Serkis, also a childhood fan of Tintin, spent his time preparing for his role by studying seaman and maritime history, trying to find a voice hidden between Edge's clear lines. And what he eventually landed on is nothing short of brilliant.
Sir Francis knew he was doomed. That he'd be hung from the highest yardarm. But they didn't reckon on one thing. Sir Francis
was a haddock.
Serkis said he chose to portray Haddock as Scottish because he felt the accent carried a rawness and an emotional availability to it that is within Haddock as well. And it's precisely from this polarity in his performance, this peculiarity in his portrayal, that he's able to reveal the humanity behind it. Haddock's alcoholism is never given much depth in the comics. There's never really a reason given for his compulsions besides a base desire to drink because it's funny. And the few times he temporarily mends his habit is entirely played as a bit, like in Tintin and the Picaros when Professor Calculus slips him a pill that basically clockwork oranges people out of liking alcohol. But in Spielberg's The Adventures of Tintin, there's a sort of a sadness, an intense vulnerability behind it that when you look hard enough has kind of always been there. More on that later. Tintin and Haddock resolve to help each other escape, exchanging exposition and demonstrating the nature of their dynamic along the way. Something I really appreciate about the structure of this film's script is that it emphasizes reflection in the same way a comic does. What I mean by this is dialogue flows in a way that leaves an open space for a character or the viewer themselves to reiterate upon new information as it comes to them, while the mystery continues to play out. For instance, Tintin compulsively responding to the revelatory lines of other characters by repeating them back to them as questions, as he often does with Captain Haddock during the flashback sequences.
Sir Francis had 3 sons, all but my bloodline failed. I am the last of the Haddocks.
Did you say 3 sons?
The unicorn was taken. The pirates were now masters of the ship.
The crew surrendered?
Or the way Tintin finds the pamphlet for Bagar in the radio room of the Caribou Jean before he and Haddock escape, and upon realizing its significance, stops reading it out loud, allowing the audience to read it ourselves, and then responds to the words we read for him.
Ruled over by Sheikh Omar Ben Salah, whose love of music and culture is matched only by his love of...
Great snakes!
Again, tossing what doesn't work and employing what does. Speaking of flashbacks, they're flashbacks. As the film progresses, Haddock begins to remember the tale that his grandfather had told him about the fate of the unicorn. And instead of leaving this to be a visually unengaging, brief revelation, Spielberg decides to stretch it out over multiple intricate sequences wherein Haddock relives the wreck of the unicorn through Sir Francis a la Assassin's Creed, casually making one of the coolest pirate films of all time inside of one of the coolest adventure films of all time. Seriously, it's so sick. At one point, the massive bull ships get tied together in the middle of this colossal storm, and after the pirate ship literally swings above the deck of the unicorn like the Buccaneer at Six Flags, Sir Francis sprints up the side of their now almost completely horizontal masts, cut them loose, ziplines back down, swings the other direction, lands, flips a torch into his hand behind his back with his cutlass, then lights a cannon and launches 5 more pirates off the opposite side of his ship. I mean, this shit is insane. Something I especially appreciate about these sequences, too, is that as Haddock slowly regains his confidence in himself, as he resolves that he isn't actually cursed to mediocrity or failure as his ancestors believed, the musical characteristics of John Williams' theme for Sir Francis make their way back into Haddock's. Most notably here, when Haddock realizes that the pirate who took the ship, Red Rackham, is actually the ancestor of Ivan Ivanovich Sakharin, which is why he took the Caribou Jean. And instead of falling into despair, throws himself and Tintin out of a window in the encampment that had saved them and resolves to get the scrolls back and find the treasure first. A visual parallel to Sir Francis leaping from the burning wreckage of the unicorn. Just as this was the moment that Sir Francis Haddock had been told by Red Rackham that his bloodline would be cursed, this is also the moment that Captain Archibald Haddock decides that they were wrong. The themes of failure and rebelling against one's own self-loathing, pessimism, and despair are the emotional core of the film. And what I especially love about the way they're handled in it is that they aren't feelings limited specifically to Captain Haddock, as they are in the comics. Haddock's strengths as a character in The Adventures of Tintin have always come from the fact that he's the only one allowed to have weaknesses as well. Tintin may show a brief flash of anger or anxiety, particularly if Snowy is hurt, and he might have been knocked out enough times to develop CTE at this point, but he never feels sadness and he never admits defeat. Calculus is hard of hearing.
You can't really like fault RJ for not understanding the consequences of being knocked out over and over and over and over and over again, because this was before, you know, people even knew what CTE was.
But it's merely a feature of endearment to the reader. Nestor struggles with Abdullah's pranks when he visits and trips on the steps of Marlin Spike Hall sometimes. Jolyon Wag just talks too much. These aren't actual flaws or displays of weakness. Tintin is a Boy Scout in the mind of Hergé as a child, and this leaves him at once unblemished and impossible to fully know. But Haddock sometimes is just genuinely unhappy. He's stubborn, he's quick to anger, he handles stress terribly, he is oftentimes wrong about things that are important, and he puts his friends at a greater risk more frequently than he doesn't. He has an irrational disdain for opera, in spite of the fact that Bianca Castafiore is always sweet to him, though she can never say his name right. He hates to be alone, hates company even more, and feels an intense sense of guilt when he reflects upon it, or when one of his traits causes a friend harm.
He basically is just like a very, I say human. He's a very much like humanized character. He represents like a lot of the negativity and a lot of the stuff that, the bad stuff that's happened to him personally. He basically is, his projection of, like, Hergé's projection of this character is basically, if Tintin is the Boy Scout, who is basically just wide-eyed and, wide-eyed and, ready to go at a moment's notice, Haddock is the weary captain who has been through enough in his life. It's like that old soldier. There was a moment in Attack on Titan where two old soldiers from opposite sides of the conflict literally both looked at each other and just said, "Are you tired of this?" "Yeah." "How about you?" "Yeah." "I'm done fighting." "Yeah, me too." And basically that's what it resolved with. Two old dogs just resolved to never fight again, and who were just sick of war. And Haddock, given all the disappointments that he's experienced in his life, he's just been beaten down by life so much that he's developed these idiosyncrasies that just make him a very fallible character. And that's one thing I like about him. I like the fact that he's a fallible character.
He is the most human being a character in the canon has ever been, by a margin so large the others aren't even on the page with him. And there's a very simple reason as to why. Because Haddock is Hergé himself.
It was his fault, you see. It was Sir Francis.
Tell me, how did you work that one out?
Because he was a figurehead of great courage and bold exploits. No one like him ever existed in my family. Why do you think I drink? Because I know I'll never be like him.
Who says that?
I didn't want to write this part originally because it'd be a lot easier not to. I realize the internet isn't exactly a place where nuance flourishes, but honestly,
True.
Ignoring art's history doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it harder to understand. And I think a lot of the contention surrounding Hergé's legacy suffers from this sort of selective memory. Empathetic dissonance, we'll call it. Besides, on a personal note, spending time with his world for the past couple of months has been a bright spot in a sort of slump for me, so I feel like I kind of owe the guy. I don't know. Been listening to the Cowboy Bebop soundtrack too much, and this Denny's Grand Slam got me in my feelings. So,
yeah,
let's talk about the war.
First World War.
The responsibility lies on the shoulders of one man. By his latest act of naked aggression, Hitler has committed a crime.
Oh no,
not only
World War II. Okay, my mistake.
But against the whole human race. Against the mothers and children leaving the cities of Britain under the great evacuation scheme with a smoothness and speed that avoids a single accident or delay.
Hergé was born as Georges Remy on May 22nd, 1907 in Etterbeek, Belgium. He always felt that his placement as a Gemini was important to understanding the conflict he often felt within himself, as well as his passive temperament and difficulty expressing emotion, and that's why I'm telling you. He wanted you to know. Belgium had fairly recently, in the context of history that is, won its independence from the Kingdom of the Netherlands in 1831, becoming a constitutional monarchy under King Leopold I, adopting French as its official language, the language of the bourgeoisie, while Flemish, Belgian Dutch of the Flanders region was the language of the middle class and the poor. The extremely right-wing Catholic Party was its dominant political force, since the secular liberals had lost their elections following a series of public outrages over the importance of religion in schools. When George was won, the Belgian parliament had to forcibly seize control of the Congo from King Leopold II's personal domain because he had killed half their total population, working them to death for ivory and rubber.
Yeah, Leopold II was evil bastard, man. And that is a very big blight on Belgium's history because of what Leopold did.
When he was 5, Jules d'Estrées published his famous letter in which he affirmed that there were no such thing as Belgians, only the pecunious Walloons and the lowly Flemish. By the time George was 7, the Germans had invaded his country for what would be the first of 2 times in his life, as part of the Schlieffen Plan to attack France through Belgium's westerly border. The year was 1914, and it would be remembered by Walloons and the Flemish alike as the Rape of Belgium. 23,700 civilians were lined up, killed, burned, bombed, and executed in courts because the Germans feared what they might do if they fought back. And 26,338 Belgian soldiers died, showing them exactly what they might do. Subjugating a land of neutral French speakers while losing a war to France itself, Germany, ever the sore losers, left the country broken and unable to fully recover, with over 700,000 unemployed and 19,000 children orphaned by a war that they did not wage. Put another way, the Germans left with a promise that they'd be back. George would later recall that in his childhood, everything felt gray. Colorless, scentless, tasteless, and of no interest. In the Remy home, there was nothing to admire, no plays to attend, no conversations to listen to, no laughter to share, and no books to read. In a kingdom with a dichotomized identity, or as d'Estrées had put it, no identity at all. George's parents were never violent with each other, and...
Yeah, the whole, like... I could never imagine growing up in a... Like, here's the thing, I'm from an area that doesn't have much. You know... We didn't really have plays or anything like that to go to. I thrived whenever I went to the movies, and it was very rare when we got to go to the movies because there were only 2 movie theaters in our area, and both of them were very bad in terms of their quality. But we kept going to them anyway because they were the only ones. And I remember there was Cinema 1 and 2, and then there was the Coburn Cinema 3. Which had three cinemas. They were all owned by the same people, and it was this old lady. She enjoyed tearing the tickets. That's the thing. She would always be there at the front door, and she would always just tear the tickets. And I remember seeing her so much at those things that I remembered her. She had like gray hair that had like red highlights in it. She had these big horn-rimmed glasses on, and she was always smiling because she always enjoyed like people coming to the movies. But when I was a kid, I lived in the back hollers, and the woods were my escape. The woods were also my escape. Outside of that, and then I remembered, when we moved out of the holler. That was when I was finally given access to the internet. I was 13 at the time, and like 12 or 13 at the time. Oh my gosh. Dude, that was that was nuts. Just having access to the internet to a certain fault and being able to do stuff. And also the fact that we moved out of the holler, and we had a pretty big house. Because my dad was working a good job at the time, then my parents got divorced, and then that was that. It was absolute hell. Shit. My dad lost his job. My mom basically had her issues. I'm not gonna go into it all here, but yeah, that was a rough time. But I could never imagine growing up in like a post-war scenario and just like imagining how there's literally nothing because of just basically just the scorched earth strategy that the Germans pulled so that the economic recovery would be impossible.
In fact, they were never even argumentative. His perspective on their marriage was that they must have loved each other, but just never said it, because they never said much of anything, instead carrying on in reserved silence. Neither happy nor unhappy, simply there. Later, he would find a chest in their attic filled with old fictional novels, and it's in this small sunbeam that the seed for his love of adventure would bloom. Huckleberry Finn, Treasure Island, The Pickwick Papers, and Robinson Crusoe became a respite from the quiet loneliness of being Georges Remy. His parents rarely spoke to him either, his only consistent means of communication with them being through drawing, which was also the only way they could curb his hyperactive nature without hitting him. Georges later recounted that the only things he could learn about his father were through the differences in how they drew objects. His father's planes drawn with the lightness of a dragonfly, and Georges with all the weight of reality, captured in meticulous detail, an insight into the burden of having to grow up too quick. In spite of this, he occasionally spoke of the love he had for his family and for his country, identity or no. On the eve of Belgium signing an armistice with the retreating German occupation, Georges was carefully capturing the image of Belgian forces routing their German oppressors. In 1920, Georges began attending St. Boniface and became a scout, which I mentioned before, but I neglected to include that the reason scouthood would remain so resonant within him is that it was arguably the only time in Georges' life outside of the covers of a book that he felt like he had a family who wanted him around. His fellow scouts gave him confidence and excitedly welcomed his presence. In spite of his incessant drawing on everything he could find, he was an excellent student as well. Sharing a passion for history and geography with his teacher, Father Priot, he earned awards for academic excellence year over year. In fact, paradoxically, the only classes he failed were for art, as he felt the conventions of teaching it were incompatible with how his mind perceived it. More than just warmth, scouting provided Georges with a strong moral compass, stressing the importance of things like staying true to your word and generosity as a daily act. Tintin isn't just an image of who Georges wished he could be, Tintin is an image of who Georges believed he could be, if only for a short time. In 1925, René Weverberg would intervene in Georges' life once again, this time getting him a job at the conservative Catholic newspaper La 20e Siècle, presided over by the man who would end up both giving Georges everything he had and leading him against everything he believed. Norbert Valès, or as Georges called him in his youth, Father. In 1922, Benito Mussolini and his black shirts had marched on Rome, and in the following year, Valès enthusiastically expressed his support of the regime in his paper, primarily because of their Catholic educational reforms. At the time, there existed an illusion among many Catholics across Belgium of a Platonic fascism, the complete lack of free will without any of the harsh realities that came with it.
I hate to tell you, but you're not gonna you can't just pray reality away. Prayer is all well and good. Like, I pray. I pray for things that are, in all honesty, way out of my control and things that I can't help. And I pray for the well-being of my family and everything, but, you know, just imagining that through fascism and through basically ruling everyone with an iron fist and telling everyone to pray to the same God, that's religious oligarchy. And I do believe that religion is important. I do believe that having the option of religion is very important, and that people should have the right to choose to be a part of that religion if they want to be. But I think that it is very hard to just act like this is how things should be. I think it's impossible to determine that. But yeah, anyway, I'm rambling again. I can't help it. I'm trying my best here, guys. I'm sorry.
By the end of the 20s, Belgium was a deeply divided nation, blinded by its own overwhelming, hyper-religious naivety and embittered by a cultural divide as old as its independence. In nearly every sense of the word, Valès manipulated Georges and exerted as much control over his life as he was capable of having, even appointing him his first wife, Germaine, who was also Valès' secretary. And Georges was grateful for the guidance because he thought of Valès as a father figure and trusted him implicitly. This decision would go on to haunt him for the rest of his life, and he would never be able to reconcile these seemingly opposite truths. The first 3 issues of The Adventures of Tintin were created entirely at the behest of Valès and under his strict creative direction and editorial license, and as such, they are an inauthentic start to the series. It's important to contextualize these stories in this way, not just to properly distance some of the responsibility of an impressionable young artist in a broadly sick society, but also to understand the bizarre tonal dissonance on display within them. On one side, Georges' ideals for what Tintin should represent: defense of the weak, kindness to strangers, and the appreciation of foreign cultures, and on the other, Valès, the evil of any non-Catholic person, the sin of democracy, and the virtues of colonialism and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, that's just... wow. Just not a good look, man. Not a good look at all.
The first issue Le Petit Vingtième would ever release was Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, an anti-communist hit piece George was directed to make, introducing Tintin as he tries to discover the truth behind the Soviet Union's lies about productivity and the redistribution of wealth, culminating in Tintin escaping from a Soviet prison and discovering plans from the Bolsheviks to destroy every capital in Europe. The next adventure, Tintin in the Congo, is easily the most vile of the three, Valez having instructed George to create a pro-colonial storyline following Tintin as he shows the Congolese people the virtues of the white Catholic Belgians. It is disgusting, and the dissonance between what George was instructed to draw and what George writes between the lines grows considerably throughout it. Reading it feels like watching two people fight through paper, as one overpowers and struggles to subdue the other. George would pull these out of print after getting control of the series and replace the pro-colonial messaging with Tintin teaching kids arithmetic and becoming friends with the Congolese people instead. He also removed any references to Catholicism or Tintin being proud to be Belgian, because he wasn't. Finally, Tintin in America.
Honestly, the thing is, given the fact that, you know, the country's divided and it's like what Belgium accomplished at the time, I mean, see, I have pride in certain senses of being an American, but at the same time, I take the good with the bad. You know, I look at the net good and the net bad that that the United States of America has given, and there's things I can take pride in, but there's also things that I know that as a countryman that we need to do better. We as a country need to grow and we need to be better. That's how you should look at all instances of good and bad throughout history. You can't change the past. No matter how much you want to rewrite history in your mind or rewrite history on page or whatever, you can't. You have to take history as it is. That's always something that I emphasize with people. History's never pretty. It's never pretty, and there's always problems. There's always going to be problems. But anyway, sorry.
America, intended as anti-American propaganda, which George took as an opportunity to reappropriate into an indictment of capitalist culture and a sympathetic plea for the Native American people, who he idolized greatly on account of the amount of reading he had done about their cultures in his days as a scout. As Tintin continued to grow, Valez's influence over George gradually shrunk. The contrast between his fourth story, Tintin and the Cigars of the Pharaoh, and his first, seeming like completely different writers. George had invented Tintin as a knight to fight the forces of evil, and now that Tintin had become an icon to the children and Valez couldn't contain him, fight the forces of evil he would. Tintin and the Blue Lotus would come next, what many consider to be his first masterpiece, and the first Tintin comic to extol the true heart of the series. And this would also be the first time that George and Tintin would take a side in a political conflict they actually believed in. It's an announcement of Japanese imperialism and the immorality of their expansion into Manchuria in 1931, even lamenting the evils of the Mukden incident as a false flag to give the Empire pretext to invade. With his other comic, Quick and Flupkey, George was even more blunt, drawing the two miserably listening to the radio as it blares nationalist speeches from Hitler, Mussolini, Harriet, Chamberlain, and Hirohito before running outside and listening to music instead. After the Blue Lotus had been finished, the head of Sino-Belgian relations was officially assigned to present a formal protest on behalf of the Japanese Empire to George over his portrayal of their ongoing war crimes, to which Chow, George's close friend from China who had helped him with the research for the Blue Lotus and even been included in the comic as a friend of Tintin's, reassured him that if they become angry, it's because you were telling the truth. This would be the first of many times an Axis power threatened George's life out of fear of the influence the adventures of Tintin had. In the same year that the Blue Lotus would release, Belgium's ultra-conservative Rex party would win 11% of the votes in the country's election, an unwelcome sign that fascism and Nazism was on the rise inside Belgium as well. 2 years later, Germany would annex Austria. A year after that, armored divisions invaded Poland. War was once again on Belgium's doorstep, and this time, George had a weapon of his own. In Tintin and King Ottokar's Scepter, George attacked the fascists head-on by way of creating a fake country for the antagonists, Borduria, modeled after Germany and represented by a man named Musler.
Mussolini and Hitler mashed into one person.
Mussolini and Hitler combined. A member of the German secret police visited George after its publication, noticing the similarity in uniforms and the fact that the Bordurians were flying Messerschmitts, and George was warned again, this time less discreetly, what would happen if he criticized the empires on his doorstep. George paid it no mind, and Germany invaded Belgium later that May, 10 days before his birthday. The invasion force was so overwhelming, the decision was not whether to surrender, it was how long could they hold out before they did, sacrificing 20-something thousand men to help the Allied troops who had tried to defend them escape the assault, an event of self-sacrifice that would later become known as simply the harbor the men were evacuated from, Dunkirk. Georges was a fierce royalist because his grandfather was raised by the Countess of Duzel and rumored to be a bastard of Leopold II's with her chambermaid who gave birth to him. Georges believed that Leopold III's surrender and refusal to flee from his people's plight was the only honorable thing he could have done to stop the bloodshed. Leopold beckoned those who had left during the invasion to come back home, and Georges was one of the first to heed the call. 200,000 Belgians were taken captive as prisoners of war in the month of May alone, including Georges' own brother, Paul, a soldier who had fought in the resistance. Georges had returned to his division to fight alongside him, but was deemed unfit for service. Survivor's guilt that would never really leave him, though he would go to his grave, refusing to admit it. Later that year, his mother would receive the news that Paul had died in a German prison camp, which was false. He'd merely tried to escape.
Yeah,
receive the news that
this scene right here, like, dude, okay. The mother collapsing, the parishioner, and then of course the soldier, and then here on the sidebar, the four brothers. This just oh. Right there, man. That shit just... Oof. That hit hard. That hit very, very hard.
Died in a German prison camp, which was false. He'd merely tried to escape, but it didn't matter. She fell into a cloud of dissociative depression and would remain there, languishing in mental torment until she died, refusing to believe either of her sons were still alive, even after the war and even when they tried to see her. Georges would forevermore live with the fear of ending up like his mother, hanging just above his shoulders like the sword of Damocles, and he couldn't bear to hear so much as a mention of her name or the hospital where she stayed. The Belgian parliament resented Leopold's surrender because he did so without their counsel, even though it was the only choice, and even though they had already fled for London, while he stayed with his people.
Yeah, ain't that a kick in the head? The Belgian parliament was just like, how dare you surrender? Meanwhile, we're going to tell you that while we've already evacuated across the channel. Sheesh.
Driving a stake even deeper into the country's open wounds and traumatized, divided populace. Many of the people were convinced he had betrayed them, and although he endured imprisonment in Austria out of devotion to them, Leopold III would never be king again, not unlike the fate of Georges himself. Le Petit Vingtième, along with nearly every other publication in the country, was shut down the second Brussels fell, the SS taking control of whichever papers remained. Many writers at the time committed to a silent protest, what they referred to as the breaking of the pens, something Georges, in his state of perpetual arrested development and profound but internalized emotional anguish, couldn't or didn't want to understand, because he thought of his work the same as a train mechanic's or a baker's. Georges looked to Leopold for guidance, and Leopold answered. In 1941, Raymond de Becquet, editor of Le Soir, called a meeting with the most important artists and journalists still in Belgium, and read them a letter addressed from the palace itself. It read, "I know that your position is not easy. You will have to struggle, you will be misunderstood, you will perhaps even be attacked, but you have to affirm Belgian sovereignty wherever necessary." The king's words were brief and solemn, but they were all Georges needed to hear. He would return to work on Tintin at the occupied Le Soir. To avoid being used for propaganda beyond the occasional caricature forced upon him, which he would retroactively strike from his works following the liberation, Georges divorced the reality of Tintin from his own permanently. Since he could no longer criticize the war directly, he would create a timeline where the war never happened. We can see this throughout both the comics and this film. It's subtle, but the timeline is inconsistent with our reality. Inaccuracies Georges would never permit by accident. Technology that either doesn't exist yet or never existed in the numbers it does, as well as an outright refusal to reference the Axis or Allied powers in the current war at all. The tools they used to wage it, now dispersed among fictional combatants in fabricated countries as if they were surplus and never put to their intended use. The newspaper Tintin picks up from Barnaby Dawes, the Interpol agent who spelled Caraboujan on the front of it, is dated 1944. Its front page discussing land reacquisition of the French from the Germans following World War I, with not so much as a whisper of the war that followed. In spite of this, the Triumph TR2 he and Haddock are shown driving at the end of the film was only produced for 3 years a decade later, 1953 to 1955. The yellow car in the far back right of the shot is a Porsche Type 32 prototype, a vehicle which never made it to production, with the imagined front end of a Fiat 508C. The red car in the front left is a Peugeot 203C that wasn't in production until
Peugeots. Jesus.
1948, as their assembly had been shut down from 1939 to 1946. The 203C noted specifically for being the first model produced by Peugeot after World War II. That is, if it ever happened. The seaplane they fly from the Caribou Jean is a Belanca CH-300 pacemaker, of which only 35 were ever built in the world on the other side of the Atlantic, at least in the reality that we live in. But Tintin's is anything but. In the Sahara Desert, as they crash land, the remains of a long-past dogfight can briefly be seen on the right of this shot. But it's not from the African theater of the 1940s because it never occurred. These are from the theater of the 1910s. The body of a British Sopwith pup and the upper wings of a German Albatross DV, barely visible under the shifting sands of time. The outposts of French soldiers who hear Snowy's barking and save them from the Sahara are post-colonial in presence, as well as the Morocco we venture through in the following scenes, even though the dissolution of the Treaty of Fez didn't come until 1956, and they're wielding MAS-36s that didn't enter mass production until after the war ended. The Caribou Jean itself, named after the Karabugaz Gulf of the Caspian Sea in the nation of Azerbaijan, was said by Georges to be based on a shipping vessel called the Glenshiel, one of a trio of sister ships he had seen in Denmark and sketched because it was so beautiful. In our world, it was commandeered by the Germans and transformed into a weapon of war. Yet in the vibrant pages of The Adventures of Tintin and the exhilarating shots of Spielberg's adaptation, a cargo ship, she remains.
Who gave you permission to board my ship?
I don't need it. I've never needed it.
As the German occupation continued, conditions only worsened. His childlike trust of anyone he spoke to would get the better of him again when another member of the German secret police visited him under the guise of being a fan and asked him how he felt about the war. Where
at that point, you know, you gotta trust nobody. Trust nobody. That's all I can say, man.
Upon Georges divulged his bitter hatred of the occupying forces and of violence in general. This would be his last warning. The severe winters and economic collapse of the country brought word of famine to Belgians, so instead of payment, Georges told his editor to take his royalties and provide his friends and family with rations instead, convincing them to even send food through the Red Cross of Portugal to his brother Paul, still a prisoner of the machine of war.
Into the cold embrace of the big blue.
Those are Portuguese markings.
You even listen.
Where's the Caribou Jean registered?
But the clouds were beginning to part. The Axis started taking L's, big time, and the Allied forces weren't letting up. April 25th, 1945, Mussolini is executed.
Yeah, and hung upside down in Rome. Oh. I actually think it was him and his whole family were executed.
5 days later, Hitler commits suicide. LOL. Better luck next time, Falcon. The war was finally coming to an end. Belgium would be freed and Europe could rebuild. But George's excitement soon turned to confusion, his confusion to shock, and his shock to sorrow. The Belgian parliament in exile had drafted a decree for the day the country would be taken back, that anyone who worked for a publication under German occupation would be tried as a collaborator, which...
Oh, what? That's such bullshit. I'm sorry, but that's just like the conscripts. People who... there was actually a great scene in Saving Private Ryan where there were these men who were approaching the Americans. They had their hands up and they were like speaking to the Americans who were liberating the beach of Normandy, and you couldn't understand what they were saying. And me, when I was a kid, I had no idea what they were saying. But as an adult, you actually can like look up what they were saying, and they basically were saying, "I'm not German. I'm Czech. I'm a prisoner. I'm a conscript. I'm not here. I'm here against my will." And the Americans shot them anyway because they were under the impression that they were Nazis. And once again, this is what happens when you paint with a broad brush and you don't do your research and you don't know what the hell you're doing. Look, I get it in war and in the heat of the moment with certain things, it's impossible to overlook things, and it's impossible to just it's impossible to get down every detail in the heat of the moment. I get that. And you know, having nuance isn't always something that you're capable of doing. But I would rather be right. I would rather do my research and be right than make an assumption and be wrong, because I've taken leaps of faith before in terms of like my leaps of logic, and I've been wrong. And I'm freely and happily willing to admit that I'm wrong. But that's the thing, is like, I'm more than willing to admit when I'm wrong on certain things. But again, when people hold their opinions so close and don't want to even consider nuance or anything like that, a lot of shit gets lost in translation, and it gets ugly super fast. Anyway, enough about that.
He had already known, as he and everyone around him listened to the BBC religiously for news from the Allies. But what George didn't expect is how loose the list's definitions were, and that he would be on it. Twice. Once as Georges Remy, and once as Hergé, father of Tintin, as if they were completely separate people. In searching through the dossier prepared for him, William Ujo, the director of intelligence of the Belgian resistance, was troubled by his conscience after witnessing a number of journalists he had felt had done little wrong lined up and killed by the liberating forces he fought with. Their true crime often simply being someone that someone else didn't like. For instance, being a person who admired the king that insulted them by staying behind when they fled. The image of one of the journalist's wives screaming that he could have stopped the execution in his face was permanently seared into his mind, and he vowed to intervene in any that followed, which just so happened to be the creator of the most beloved cartoon on the continent. The case against George was simple. He collaborated by working for a newspaper during the occupation, and it is for this that his legacy is most severely misunderstood and maligned. Ignoring his repeated criticisms of the imperialist forces, his attempts to re-enlist after his service had ended to defend his country, enduring multiple threats on his life by 2 different Axis powers secret police, and neglecting his generosity as a daily act to those around him who would have starved or gone homeless had he not. The number of competing journalists and editors who Georges thought were his friends that wanted to see him dead appalled Ujo to tears. Scribbled between the lines of denunciations was the insatiable desire for vengeance on the part of journalists who had broken their pens, and those who had wished their biggest competition to be smote from this earth. Ujo closed the case, and Georges was once again saved by Tintin narrowly escaping with his life, but this time he couldn't get back up. Many people in Belgium now saw him as incivique, not a citizen, not for his actual wrongdoings, but the allegations themselves. He was no longer a human being. Publishers in France refused to distribute his works for the next few years, even though the weekly that Tintin was now appearing in had been founded by fighters from the resistance, and even though the imprisoned soldiers of Saint-Gilles had told them that they waited for the paper every week during the war because Tintin was their only breath of fresh air. It didn't matter. Depressed and neurotic quickly entered his vocabulary of words to describe himself, though most often he would simply state, "I am dead." The work required of him to get Tintin back up and running at twice the pace he had previously produced it at, on top of reworking his older comics to remove and restructure as many ethical and artistic aberrations as he could, was just too much for him to handle, and he began to suffer cataclysmic breakdowns, disappearing for months at a time without a trace, intermittently sending letters to Germaine, at once professing his love for her, his misery with himself, his bitterness towards the world, and his affairs born from a crisis of identity. Germaine once writing him, "If you won't come back for me, then at least return for Tintin." He didn't want to be Catholic or Belgian anymore. The Boy Scout had come apart at his seams, and he no longer felt like Tintin, so he wrote himself in again. This time as a brooding, temperamental, miserable sailor who would rather drown in a bottle than think of his own past or future, haunted by the rumored eminence of his ancestry, forever falling short of his own system of beliefs and continuously tumbling further down into an unending pit of guilt and confusion. But still Georges. Tintin and Haddock are remarkably similar characters beneath the surface, and I think Spielberg highlights this brilliantly. In spite of this figurative dark age of his life, Georges still had a lot of Tintin in him, and this is what makes Haddock such a good sidekick to him. Their ethics are fundamentally the same, but perfectly opposed in their expression. The two have an incorruptible aversion to killing, although Tintin's is expressed as deliberate, whereas Haddock always accidentally spares his opponent. For instance, Tintin shooting the spotlight to blind the henchman on the Caribou Jean, while Haddock jokingly drops his his off the side of the ship, only for Spielberg to then reveal that he was caught by one of the ropes. He's steadfast to a fault, marching to certain death to save Tintin in Tibet, and putting himself in the middle of what he knows is a trap to retrieve Bianca Castafiore from San Theodoros, even though he hates her singing and she never says his name right. Later in his life, George would admit that Bianca was just his child-brain way of expressing the suffocation he felt with his wife. Conservative and ultra-Catholic, assigned to him by Valles, in spite of the fact that she hadn't done anything specifically wrong. They remained friends after their divorce, and he visited her every Monday until he died. Haddock offers the grounds of Marlin Spike Hall.
See, you see, people marry each other because they think it's what they want. And then, later on, they realize, this isn't what I want. This is literally me. Like, this is who I am at this point, and not who I am going to be. And people do change over time. People do change, and sometimes they get better. Sometimes they become almost completely different people. I like my dad when he was 25 versus my dad now that he's almost 60. I mean, my dad, when I knew him, when I first gained memories of him, he was still in his 20s. And he was young, headstrong, and just had just like every aspiration to just like work himself to death and work his fingers to the bone, because it's all that he ever wanted to do. But now seeing him at almost 60, and seeing him just being just seeing him slowed down by the wheels of time, and just being seeing him be still my dad, but a different person on so many levels, it's insane. Man.
All to the Romani encampment he meets in the Castafiore Emerald after they tell him that the local police condemned them to the outskirts of town near a dump. The actual thief of the emerald is just a bird, subverting both the police's expectations in the comic and the readers in Europe at the time, highlighting and criticizing the continued unjust treatment of the Romani people following the Holocaust.
Yeah, the Romani were mistreated massively. And no one talks about the Romani being victims of like ethnic genocide, which I know that the Holocaust is mostly focused on, Jewish, people of Jewish ancestry and the Jewish religion and the Jewish faith as the primary victims of the Holocaust. And yes, they were the biggest victims in terms of just like outright targeting. But the Polish people, the Romani, homosexuals, the mentally retarded, special needs, people who had no sense of people who had no control over the fact that they were born the way that they are. It's insane, dude. I'm sorry.
To be clear, I agree that George could be kind of an asshole. I mean, a lot of what he did, or what he was coerced into doing and later apologized for and struck from his publications, fucking sucks. The reality is his cartoons were nestled beneath vitriolic propaganda that probably only sold because they were there. I'm not saying he was a perfect guy, but he wasn't saying that either. I just don't think it's honest to speak of his legacy from one side just because it's easier to only mention half of it. The truth is, he was both at once. A paradox. He was the kind of man to be notoriously terrible at dealing with kids and then devote his entire life to inventing a parallel world for them to exist in to save them the horrors of the one they knew. The kind of man that once was told by a psychiatrist that he would die if he couldn't let go of his obsession with work, which he professed himself made him miserable, only to respond, "A scout smiles when there are problems," and then leave. Ignoring the advice entirely and turning around to produce what is the most profound masterpiece in his body of work based on the nightmares nightmares that had haunted him, surrounded by nothing but white. The kind of man that would struggle to maintain friendships, but spent the latter 50 years of his life tracking down someone he knew for a few months to give him a hug and thank him for showing him calligraphy after writing a comic about how badly he wished he could find him. The kind of man that was simultaneously so self-obsessed with his work that he refused to credit his assistants, but wanted so badly to be anyone else but himself that he changed his name to his own initials written backwards, pronounced in French. Hergé. The furthest he could ever get away from being Georges Remy. A rift between the two sides of himself so vast that even those who wanted to send him to his death thought they were two different people. Not only did he create an acutely self-aware portrait in Archibald Haddock, he played on the very things that made him miserable for a laugh, still struggling with the hindrance of emotional development that had come with growing up too quick, and with the comics beginning to take 5-6 years to complete. Every one of them was still so full of optimism and cheerfulness and a look towards the future, sending Tintin to the moon a decade before we got there in Explorers on the Moon, or creating a supersonic passenger jet years before they were unveiled in Tintin in Flight 714. And I think that's the real legacy of Hergé, in spite of his long list of mistakes. A man whose intentions were to bring warmth to a world that seldom gave him any back, and in spite of the fact that he was so often consumed by the opposite. As the saying goes, humor is the polite expression of despair, and Captain Haddock is a truly funny creation. After this absolutely stunning chase scene through the streets of Bagar, I mean, truly, this is the best chase sequence I have ever seen in anything. At one point, Tintin ziplines with the handlebars of a motorcycle. Like, the verticality of the set pieces, the divergence of the lines the characters take throughout the environments, the barrage of perfectly timed slapstick, the way it's seamlessly captured and composed, featuring all the main characters scrambling for the same objects in entirely distinct ways, which reflect their respective dispositions, taking heat, in fact, from Chaplin himself, who once said that a chase is only the pretext for humor, and that action without a gag is doomed to failure. Our characters reach the sea, and Tintin gives up the scrolls that they had come so far to retrieve, to save Snowy and Haddock's lives, in spite of Haddock pleading to let him drown. Afterwards, when Haddock prompts him for their next plan, as he invariably does in the comics, Tintin instead deflates, expressing his own despair because he thinks he failed. In this moment, Spielberg and co. do something that no one else ever could, including Hergé, with an adaptation of his work. And it wouldn't be as appreciable if you couldn't see it through the frame of reference that is his life, because they allow Hergé's inner child to express sadness for the first time in the entire canon, and his adult self gets to be the one to comfort him. For once.
Failed. There are plenty of others willing to call you a failure, a fool, a loser, a hopeless souse. Don't you ever say it of yourself. You send out the wrong signal. That is what people pick up. Do you understand? You care about something, you fight for it. You hit a wall, you push through it. There's something you need to know about failure, Tintin.
Failure's part of life.
You can never let it defeat you.
Steven Spielberg's The Adventures of Tintin isn't a perfect adaptation because it has a discussion about Hergé or his work. It's a perfect adaptation because it has a discussion with him. It so perfectly translates the minutiae of what made The Adventures of Tintin magical to the medium of film, the modified version of Newton's Law within which Thompson and Thompson function purely for the sake of jokes, the goofy indignation with which its criminals behave, as if Aristides Silk the pickpocket is more insulted by the notion that he's a thief than he is fearful of being arrested as one. The sheer commitment to the physical comedy that the comics were so well known for, like Tintin trying to quietly retrieve the keys on the Caribou Jean, only for the entire crew and a shark to unflinchingly collapse on top of him but stay asleep anyways. Even the little things, the way their clothes wrinkle but never sharply, maintaining the flowing and rounded style of Hergé's line work in 3 dimensions, the consideration given to the clarity of each movement of each character, every operation so direct, so clear that even at its most visually chaotic, it never becomes overwhelming, and yet it manages to cultivate this this sense of fluidity, this bounciness that is impossible to truly capture in our world. Hergé so often predicted the future with his comics, whether it was revolutions in politics or vast leaps forward in the world of science, that it would only be fitting if the technology to successfully bring his adventures to life hadn't even been invented yet. I've said this of a few films before, but truly, The Adventures of Tintin is a miracle of technology, and Spielberg took full advantage of this. NVIDIA had to co-develop a new means of shadow mapping with Weta Digital called Pantarray that required anywhere between 100 and 1,000 times more computational power to use to get it to look the way it does. If this film entered principal production even 1 year earlier, we wouldn't have this. I mean, look at its transitions. It's literally the only mocap animated feature to clear the leap over the uncanny valley, and I know I keep repeating it, but it's because they had the sensibilities to drop what didn't work and keep what did. Every character's silhouette follows Hergé's clear lines to the dot. No shape is changed, merely its presentation. Cartoon compositions captured in a realistic canvas, allowing its director to be his own camera operator and to pilot the audience's perspective around every scene on a whim, just like Hergé did. And their attention to detail is impeccable. The world and everything in it captured so perceptively that I can tell at a glance when the henchmen are driving a Volvo LV125 or a Ford Tudor V8, or when Tintin rides an Indian Model 741 that was never used in the war it was built for, because in this world it never happened, just as Hergé captured the road to Neon or the street scenes of Geneva with a photographic level of accuracy. I mean, this is an exact replication of the cockpit of a plane designed in the 1920s, of which maybe 5 still exist on the planet. It's a masterpiece dedicated to its master, so full of love not just for adventures, but for the man who gave them to us. Some of its more subtle references, like the fountain in the center of the absolutely stunning palace Bianca Castafiore's concert takes place in, so Sakharin's falcon can steal the unicorn after she shatters its protective glass, being a crab with golden claws, or this quick pass by Cut's the butcher shop during Snowy's chase, are so cheeky, for lack of a better term, wholly unobtrusive to the film, but crafted with such joy and admiration behind them, created by what is possibly the strongest production team we will ever see, unafraid to break a few of his rules because they know he would have broken them too. Just as Haddock discovers the treasure Sir Francis had taken with him in the hidden room of Marlinspike Hall at the end of the film after defeating Sakharin because only a Haddock could spot a singular island out of place on the globe beside them, everyone who worked on this film understood that only Hergé could write a new Adventures of Tintin, and he's been gone for a very long time now, so they didn't stay under the shadow that he left. That's the trick. That's the ethos of Hergé's work to me, to constantly move forward, even when it's hard to. An image of optimism and friendship, ever growing yet suspended in time, as if we're looking at it through a crystal, or in this case, a magnifying glass, projected through a beam of light, illuminating what was once left in the dark. Only 20% of the Adventures of Tintin's box office came from America, which was honestly to be expected. As a result, its planned sequels fell into development hell and have been there ever since. So this is probably the only look we'll ever get at what Hergé's world really looked like on the silver screen. But honestly, I think it's enough. Gun to my head, I can't name a better adventure to you. And I can't think of a better way to compliment a legacy. It was a great film, George. I wish you could have seen it. But Spielberg made sure you could, in your own way. After all, you're the first person we see, capturing his surroundings in a quiet street in Brussels, enjoying the morning sun, casting a shadow worthy of a giant. Have a good night.
Si un jour la vie t'arrache à moi, si tu meurs, que tu sois.
All right, well, damn, what a friggin' crazy ass okay. The thing is with you look at Steven Spielberg and you look at his history of filmmaking. You look at Schindler's List, without a doubt his most dramatic film. Then you look at Jurassic Park, arguably his biggest spectacle film. And then you have even in the modern era, Ready Player One, Then, of course, you look back on what some consider his golden era. From Jaws to E.T. I mean, sheesh. That's the thing with this movie, is that you had a creative powerhouse behind it, and I really wish that we could have gotten more. I really do. Let's see. The Adventures of Tintin. Oh, gosh. Films. There we are. Let's see. Proposed sequels. Stated that Jackson is working on the sequel. So, yeah. Dude, I just wish that... I wish that this could have gotten more notice here in the States. Adventures of Tintin 2. Yeah, proposed sequels. That's what it's under. And it'll be directed by Peter Jackson and produced by Steven Spielberg. So Spielberg will still be involved. So, man, I'm hoping that we get more of this. I watched this in theaters, man, and it was good. It was really good. But I don't know. I really hope that we get more. But I know that Janusz Kaminski, he's still around. Then of course Michael Kahn, I think 94, dude. Holy hell. And then of course there's also John Williams, who is retiring from film production. I think he said that he is going to be retiring this year. He at least I'll stick around for a while. Oh gosh. Really? Oh my gosh. I was just saying, John Williams, I thought he said that he was going to retire. Would likely be his last plan to retire and focus solely on composing concert music. However, he reversed this decision. God dang it, John. Making me look like a fool. Damn. Okay, well, either way, I don't really have anything else to add to this. All I know is that I'm glad that I was able to watch this in its entirety. So yeah, Giotto Cook, Anarchy 17, this was for y'all. Giotto Cook, I hope that this pleased you in some way. And as for Anarchy, thank you very much for the donation, and thank you very much for just telling me to get this out of the way. So, anywho, I think that's going to do it for this one, everybody. This was Tintin and the Shadows of Giants. Hopefully y'all enjoyed, and hopefully we will see you all in the next one. So until then, I am Nate. I will see y'all then. Peace.